Welcome to Stochastic Agency, where the random issues never cease. So let it be known that while I have love in my heart for the art of necromancy, I don't often resurrect dead horses. In the description below, I've got some links to other perspectives on the subject today. So let's talk about Fiat. And here it's hard not to cover old ground. So let's ignore cowboy wisdom and raise this horse from the dead to give it one more ride. What is Fiat and how does it work? Well, a textbook definition is going to say something like, it's a sanction or decree. It's an arbitrary pronouncement by an individual or a group of people that have the authority to enforce it, right? The king or a tribunal rules by fiat. Now, on the web, you might see this situation arise where the person running the game needs to make a decision, generally because there's no clear ruling or mechanics to deal with what a player or players want to do. Or it may be certain abilities or mechanics that rely on the people at the table to say X occurs now. Now, when to roll for an action isn't necessarily on a timer. So what is Fiat? Hopefully you can get the idea. It's make a call. It's yet another way to just keep the game running smoothly. So where does Fiat come into play during game? Rulings outside the rules and player creativity. You've never had this happen, right? Where a player decides to use a mundane item for something that's not covered by the rules. So the person running the game, after hearing their description, decides that it makes contextual sense. This is simply agreement by fiat. And that means that it's whenever a player describes something that they want to do, that it's sensible within the context. Environmental factors. Let's say that a person running the game decides that during a rainstorm, ranged attacks are less effective because of poor visibility and slippery terrain, even though there's no explicit rule in the game for this. Now, I know this is highly unlikely to exist, but let's just run with this for a second. In that kind of context, such a thing makes sense because there is no supporting rule. This is simply ruling or a rule by fiat. Narrative pacing. I'm sure you've never had this happen, right? Suppose the players unexpectedly bypass an encounter by taking an alternate route. Now, you players out there, you know who you are. Suppose the person running the game decides to use fiat to adapt gameplay to the new location so that the experience keeps its intended tension. Now, were you paying attention there? Now, have you ever heard me say that players should be paying attention? Did you hear how that was phrased? Adapt gameplay to the new location, not move the encounter to a new location. More on that later. NPC reactions. This probably has come up. So suppose a character insults a powerful NPC, a noble, and the noble's honor guard immediately surrounds and detains the party without rolling initiative. This is prioritizing narrative consequences over a combat sequence. So did you hear that description? Surrounds and detains without initiative, not surrounds and attacks. This is just simply using fiat to increase the tension and keep the pacing moving. Streamlining existing rules. You may have seen something like this. So suppose the mechanics of the game that you're playing have something non-intuitive, like say, when two people decide to wrestle each other. By homebrewing or remixing it to make it easier to deal with is simply fiat by redesign. Homebrewing. Fiat as design. By now, you've probably heard of a game called Blades in the Dark. In it, they have a mechanic called load. Now, in a nutshell, this mechanic deals with equipment, and it works backwards, meaning that when the character encounters something that they need a piece of gear for, contextually, they have it. This is fiat by player agency. Fiat is flexible. So by providing a way for all the players to respond to unexpected moments in the gameplay, it encourages creativity and keeps things from getting bogged down in the rules. And when used well, fiat elevates a game in the way that rules never can. Rules can't account for every crazy idea that players come up with. You've probably heard yes and. It's simply fiat by agreement that prompts and asks for additional information. One of the best uses for fiat is for guidance and encouragement of creativity, which keeps the momentum going. That's what we want. It does this by creating examples of when, where, how, why, and what creative thinking is engaging in tabletop role-playing games. Sometimes the rules can devolve into mechanical discussions. And Fiat is the skill and art of making quick decisions that enables everyone to stay engaged. Now, this does depend on everybody's familiarity with the rules, so Fiat may happen more or less often. It is the power to inject unexpected elements that the players won't know about to keep them on their toes. Maybe they were based on all those comments they keep making about things going on during gameplay, you know. And you'll often hear me say context is king. Fiat is the prime example here. Because you can and buy and read whatever you want, Fiat is the empowerment to vary information. The risks of overusing Fiat. Can you finish the sentence? But with great power comes. You know, overusing Fiat can undermine the game when you're not careful. It does this by constantly forcing a tabletop conversation in a particular direction that might make players feel like their choices, and when you ask them to make a die roll, irrelevant. Many players don't want to play in a tabletop role-playing game with predetermined outcomes. You know what the hobby-wide jargon for this is, so let's try a few more examples where this can come up. I'm sure you've had players devise a clever plan for sneaking past a group of guards in disguises and using bribes. I mean, after all, what else is there for players to be spending all of that hard-earned gold and treasure on? Let's say that the person running the game decides that the ruse doesn't work because they planned this encounter, or they just believe that for some reason a fight needs to break out. Invalidating player actions and dismissing creativity to stick to the preset narrative is not a good use of Fiat. Do you remember when I mentioned, did you hear how that was phrased? Adapt gameplay to the new location, not move the encounter to a new location. Some of you may already know what I was referencing there, the quantum ogre. That's the idea that an encounter that the person running the game has planned happens no matter what. It's another hotly debated method for running a game. Now I'd like to introduce a term here, agent. Now my understanding of it from the world of computer game development is that an agent refers to an NPC or other entities having distinct behaviors, goals, a decision-making process that can dynamically respond to the environment and player actions. Do you find that kind of easy to follow and understand? So let's alter it and adjust it slightly, like so many things in the English language. For me, an agent in a TTRPG is any entity having distinct behaviors with or serving goals, with or without a decision-making process, that can respond dynamically to the environment and player actions. So why would I try and redefine it this way? Well, in a mystery, a clue is my agent. Even though it has no distinct behavior, it doesn't have a decision-making process because itself is an inanimate object. Now I use Fiat here to adapt its position dynamically to the game environment and the player's actions in order to serve a goal. In this case, the goal is to assist in solving a mystery. So a key concept here is to keep an agent or use Fiat in logical, contextual ways. So there should be trust when using Fiat to be fair and consistent. If it feels arbitrary or biased, it can lead to disengagement at the least, resentment at the worst. So let's say in one session, a player rolls high on a persuasion check to calm an angry mob. The decision is made that they can't be quelled, right? Even after asking for a roll. In a later session, another player uses persuasion in the same way and it happens flawlessly. That kind of inconsistency can make players feel like their outcomes are based on whims and their decisions to take action or roll dice are pointless. I was running a dungeon crawl once where a player sneaked into a room containing a sleeping jailer ogre. In the back of the room was a large cell containing several hungry, deliriously crazed prisoners. One player decides to try and sneak in and open the door, and all effort was made through description and the character's experience while trying to open the door that something detrimental could happen. Now, I'm well aware of the so-called rule of cool, and in most cases, I'll agree by Fiat, but not here and not with this example. I understood the intention. Get the ogre jailer to attack get the prisoners to attack the ogre jailer. Did you hear that though? The essential part of communication was hungry and deliriously crazed. This is important to point out because And the ability to predict or influence any behavior of the prisoners is uncertain. You need this kind of communication to ensure that Fiat has validity within context, right? Using it without considering the world's logic or context can break immersion. That's okay. So if you say a town is impenetrable in one session, but in the next session they waltz right in, it can undermine your believability. So what's the context in these situations? In one session, a ritual requires a rare ingredient to get through a magic barrier. Later, the party encounters the same barrier, but the Fiat decision made here is they just walk right by it. Now, the players might feel a little confused or maybe get frustrated. Again, what's the context? Okay, so I know, I hear you. Don't keep adventure gatekeeped behind a paywall. To that I say, to each their own. When I run games, something I make poignantly clear is that you may need to do something or have something or find another way to do or get something accomplished. This is how I try to communicate clearly about an expectation of a game. So how can you use Fiat? Be transparent. Now, after so many years and so much discussion about running games, a lot of this should really feel like an old hat by now. When you make a ruling, you might need to explain it. This is one of those ways you establish and build trust that helps the players understand why and how you come to these decisions. If you as a player are unsure about a Fiat call, you need to ask about it, preferably after the game. Stay consistent. Where possible, Fiat should align with the verisimilitude of the established rules and game logic. If you make a unique ruling, take notes, stick with it for future sessions. Use it sparingly. Reserve Fiat for when it's truly needed, much like the same advice we get about rolling dice too often. There are going to be ambiguous rules. There are going to be edge cases. If the game system can handle it, let it do its job. Keep player agency front and center. Fiat should empower, not overshadow. It should open possibilities and not shut them down, negate contextually relevant novel thinking. So in this video, this is pretty much the basics. It's going to take practice. It's a powerful, ubiquitous tool that I've seen used in pretty much every game I've ever played and ran. Use it to create remarkable moments to remember. And like many other skills, practice it, analyze it, and understand you're going to make mistakes. Fiat is more likely to be respected when it's not argued over, when you've established trust. So what about you? Do you have tips and stories about Fiat in your games? Leave them in the comments below. I'll invite your likes and dislikes and subscription if you want to, but only at your discretion. But before you go, one last question. Is the person running the game the only player at your table that has all the power of Fiat? So until next time, get out there and play a different game. But just remember, you've only got agency until you roll those dice.